Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion, and here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached the 15th day of February in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that your day is well. I know that there is some extreme weather happening in places around the country. In the southeast, there are tornadoes apparently struck overnight, and of course, in California, they're looking at a series of storms coming in off the Pacific that threaten several inches of rain on top of the flood threat that they had earlier in the week. We need to keep our eye on that one. And, of course, Maine continues to be pounded with heavy snowfall. They're looking at their third storm in 6 days. And it's difficult. I know that throughout many parts of the country and the world, of course, people are hurting and the weather is bad and all of that. I say that all because I think we're looking at a pretty good situation with our weather here. I've noticed that in the last 10 minutes or so, the sun has just come out here. It was kind of overcast and cloudy, very chilly and windy throughout most of the morning, but it looks like the sun's coming out now. But the wind is still pretty strong. So. Welcome to a Wednesday program. This is our third and final program of this calendar week here at the Virtual Center. I kind of look on Wednesdays when we get to Wednesday and we've had a successful Monday and Tuesday. I really look at the week as a success because we were able to fulfill our full broadcast obligations this week, which is good. I say that because in previous couple of weeks we didn't do too well on that score. So. I hope that you are well and things in your life are as they should be, as you would hope that they are. Thank you for your continued support of this program and for the Head On Radio Network. We look forward to hearing from you. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number, we have a phone number that'll get you immediately on the air so that you have an opportunity to sound off on some of the issues of the day, and there are many of them, of course. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly one-on-one with me via email, I would be honored to hear from you. I'll do the very best I can to share your thoughts and your concerns with our listeners, provided you think it's okay. If you don't, I hope that you'll tell me that in the email itself. Just to say basically I prefer that you not share this, and I will not. But if you're putting forth a point of view or something and it seems insightful and provocative and something that our other listeners might benefit from hearing, I'd like to get it on the air one way or the other. And if you'd like to do it, we have a phone number for that. But if you'd rather not, then I'll be glad to do it if it's okay with you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And let me again encourage you to take a look at our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook's homepage, facebook.com, when you get to that page, there is a search box at the top. Just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And there are a number of recent postings on there on issues of the day. I'm going to open today's program with a posting that I put on there last night. It's not really that provocative necessarily. It's quite provocative because of what's going on. But it constitutes more than anything else my efforts to try to put together in summary form some of the things that have been happening, some of the things that we talked about here in the Virtual Center yesterday. I tried to capture that as best I could in a recounting of some of the major events over the last 24 to 36 hours in relationship to the Michael Flynn situation in Washington, because I do believe that the issues and the reports are coming from so many different directions at the same time that it's really difficult to try to keep them all in line and handle them all. I mean, it's overwhelming. And my concern is, as it has always been, is that when we become overwhelmed with information, there comes a point in time when we just inclined to throw up our hands and say, oh, the heck with it. I can't understand this. It's beyond me. I'll wait till everything settles, wait till the dust settles, and then I'll go back when everything quiets down and kind of try to figure out what exactly went on. Well, the fact of the matter is what we're dealing with is something that is going on. And it seems to me that it's very important that all of us, and I say that very, very advisedly, because there are a number of people that never pay much attention to anything. We know that. But those are not the people who regularly listen and participate on the Head On Radio Network or in the Virtual Center or any of those other things. Basically what we're talking about here, we are the people that ultimately need to stay involved and need to stay on top of what's going on. So I'm really hopeful that the people that we deal with and that we're communicating with on a day-to-day basis are not inclined to give up because the information is overwhelming. But I thought that since we had done a program yesterday and tried to put so much of this information together, I thought that it might be a good idea while it's still fresh to get as much of it down on paper and put it down. And I did get a number of comments from readers of our Facebook page who basically said, thanks for the summary. I really appreciate it. And, it seems spot on and it kind of puts things into context for me or something, because that's all I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to argue a point of view or anything else. At least I wasn't consciously doing that. Of course, we all have opinions. We all have things we like and things we don't like, and it comes through in what we say and how we say it and how we write and all the rest of it. I know that. The only people that are truly objective are people who have died. You can't, if you live in this world, you can't be objective toward many of the things that are going on in it. And I realize that. What we have to try to make a point of doing is being fair. Not being objective, being fair. And what that means is making sure that we take account of the fact that there are people on different sides of the issues and there are people who legitimately disagree. And it's very, very important to take those issues into consideration in all we do. So that's kind of what I'd like to at least begin with, is a kind of a brief summary. It's not that long of what we did and for the bulk of yesterday's program related to the Michael Flynn situation. And then we can kind of move on from there, I hope. I'm going to try something today that I haven't really had an awful lot of time to put together, but the reality is that it's quite provocative. And since today is our last day before we take a 4 or 5 day hiatus before our next program, live program here in the Virtual Center is not scheduled till next Monday. So I thought, well, it might be a good idea to try to get this on and give people a few days to digest it. And then if people need to react to it, they can do that when we come back on the air the first of the week. But it's kind of an effort to pull together some things that don't, at least on the surface, appear to be connected, but in reality, in at least one way, do seem somewhat connected. And I think, in other words, I think that there's a thematic way to tie an awful lot of what's happening, not only in Washington, but in key parts of the world as well, together. And I believe that a couple of things came out this morning that made me realize, or enabled me to realize, that indeed there is a thematic way to try to link all of this stuff together. It doesn't necessarily mean that one has to believe one way or the other about some of the things that are going on, so much as it's a way to understand. It's a way to take the overwhelming amount of information that seems to be flowing all around us and attach it to something which makes some sense, which at least seems to tie a lot of it together and give it meaning. That's the only way that we can deal with some of this. I mean, this is a classic example of the advantages and disadvantages of the information revolution. Access to information is more available than it ever was before. But the fact of the matter is, it becomes critical with the increase in information to be able to handle it, to be able to organize it in ways and evaluate it in ways which make it possible for us to focus on the things that ought to be focused on and to put aside the things that are not. And that's an awful lot of what we depend on our education system to do. Unfortunately, I don't think our system of education is doing that, but that's another story for another day. The issue that I used, or the theme that I used in trying to explain this, is the issue of trust. And the reason I did that is because while we appreciate the importance of trust, it's important to recognize that the issue of trust, or the lack of it, is really what led to the resignation of Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor to President Trump. Translation: it appears that the president and the administration really reached the point where they no longer trusted or had faith in Michael Flynn. He resigned, but it's very clear, and it has come out in a number of venues since then, that he was asked to resign. In other words, in traditional, to be expected Trumpian style, President Trump basically, in effect told Michael Flynn, "You are fired," going back to his show, The Apprentice. But he did give Flynn the opportunity to submit a letter of resignation. Sean Spicer, in his press conference yesterday, and you'll remember that when we came on the air yesterday at 1:30 here in the East, yesterday afternoon, I mentioned that there was a press conference at the White House that I thought was just getting underway. Well, that press conference did happen. And in that press conference, Sean Spicer said that the loss of trust is what caused the president to ask for Michael Flynn's resignation. All of that seems so simple. I think all of us, I heard Speaker Ryan this morning on the MSNBC Morning Joe show later in the morning. It was close to 9 a.m. Speaker Ryan made the point in reaction to this that if I were president of the United States, I would have done exactly the same thing. I mean, when you lose trust in an advisor holding a position of trust, you really don't have much alternative except to dismiss that person. All of this seems so simple. The fact of the matter is, of course, we realize that this story is a lot of things other than simple. There's a lot more to it than that. It's much more complicated. Kellyanne Conway, you'll recall her, on the day before yesterday, on Monday evening, reported that Michael Flynn enjoyed what she called the full confidence of the president. At exactly the same time that she was saying that, Flynn was being asked to submit his resignation. So in reality, what she was telling us was wrong. The question, I mean, we don't know whether she knew that and whether she was just saying it anyway. She didn't know that what she was saying was being contradicted at the very moment that she was saying it. Yesterday morning, 12 hours later, on the Today Show, Kellyanne Conway said that Flynn had resigned because he lied to Vice President Trump. It's important to think about that. Because, in effect, what that means is that he was that Flynn was being asked to resign, not because of what he did or might have done, or not because of the dangers to the security of the nation in what he did. He was being asked to leave because what he did became public information. In other words, what he did became news. It was not any longer possible to suppress what he did because the vice president had gotten out before the nation and told the nation exactly what Flynn told him, which was an untruth. Once it got to that point, then he had to go. So Kellyanne Conway was saying that the president's dishonesty with the vice president, Flynn's dishonesty with the vice president is really what pushed this over the edge and caused the president to ask for Flynn's letter of resignation. This raises some serious questions. Some 3 weeks ago, the Associate Attorney General of the United States, Sally Yates, informed the White House that the intelligence community had in its hands evidence from transcripts of Flynn's conversations with the Russian ambassador that indicated that what Flynn was saying about not having breached the topic of sanctions at all, in fact, was not true. That what Pence had told the vice president, that sanctions had not come up, was not true. And what Associate Attorney General Sally Yates said was that Pence had given the Russians information and then basically denied it, which meant that he had put himself in a vulnerable position vis-a-vis the Russians. He had created a situation where it had become possible for the Russians to blackmail Michael Pence in other words, to threaten to make public the lies that he had committed if he didn't do such and such that they wanted. And the Associate Attorney General was informing the White House that this was a very, very dangerous situation for the administration and for the nation, and that the administration needed to know about it. That was 3 weeks ago. 1 week ago, this past weekend, as you know, Sally Yates, the Associate Attorney General, was fired, ostensibly because she refused to support the president's travel ban. But this whole Flynn situation raises the question whether, in fact, the termination of Sally Yates might possibly have been because she had basically blown the whistle on what Michael Flynn had been saying or talking about with the Russians. So the fact remains, and let me tell you, that just before we came on the air, I would say 10 minutes before we came on the air, I was taking one last look at the Washington Post website, and there's a feature story on the front page that addresses this very issue. What this means is that the White House knew that that Flynn was not telling the truth 14 days before it told Vice President Pence that Flynn was not telling the truth. It became very clear that Vice President Pence only found out about Michael Flynn's lack of honesty this past Thursday, February 9th. That meant for 14 days, the White House was in possession of information that it knew was resulting in the fact that the vice president was appearing on television and telling untruths and didn't basically inform him as to what the truth was. The Washington Post article today, right now, is raising the question, what does that tell us about the relationships between Michael Pence, the vice president, and the Trump administration? Does this suggest that the president and the people closest to him are taking advantage of Michael Pence and not bringing him into the inner circles of administration policy? Does it suggest that they don't trust Pence? Or does it suggest that they don't want to taint Pence with some of this stuff which which they might feel he doesn't need to know? It's unclear what this says about Pence, but there's no question that this whole situation raises some serious questions about the personal relationships within the inner circles of the Trump administration. And then finally, there's one more piece to this particular puzzle. And that is, last Friday evening, when the president and first lady were boarding the plane for the flight to Mar-a-Lago for the weekend, Trump was asked by a reporter about Michael Pence, about the Michael Pence situation. And the president said that he knew nothing about it, but that he would make it a point to look into it. The implication, of course, was that this was total news to him. He didn't know there was a Michael Flynn situation. Well, the fact of the matter is, now we know that Sally Yates had informed the White House 2 weeks earlier that there was a Michael Pence situation, which means that the president basically didn't tell the truth to the reporter, or basically lied in response to that question. So here we are. Why did the White House allow the vice president to go on television and report things that it knew were not true? Why was Sally Yates fired? Because she refused to support the president's travel ban? Or because she's the one that made the public the information about the deceptions going on within the White House? And then finally, there's another question raised by all of this. The president boarding Air Force One last Friday evening. Did the president know but not want the press to know at that time? Is that why he lied? Or even worse, what if he didn't know? What if he was being honest to the reporter's question and didn't know about the Michael Flynn situation? Then that would mean that the staff around him didn't basically let him know what it knew from Sally Yates. It seems to me, and this is the point that we were making yesterday, that the whole situation, that the house of cards around this administration in the first 3.5 weeks of its holding office is falling apart. It's crumbling. And as a result of that, there are a lot of speculations going around, rumors, nuances, innuendos, what ifs. There's no question that the situation, when you create a situation as muddy and blurry as this one, then you are asking for the rumor mills to crank up, because people begin to speculate as to why there's so much inconsistency and apparent confusion going on within the upper echelons of government. So here are a few. One, and this one is being talked about openly around Washington and in the media now. Up until now, the general thoughts were that even though the intelligence community has documented, and I don't think anybody anymore questions the legitimacy of the documentation, except the president. We'll get to that in a moment. The fact of the matter is, most people are assuming that the president hacked into the Democratic website, Democratic National Committee website, and into Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party campaign's emails, and began to make them public. We know that all of that was going on. Now we're pretty sure that the Russians were behind it. But most people assumed that the other candidate for office, Donald Trump, during the campaign, was aware of it and let it happen because it was benefiting him and hurting Hillary Clinton. But he wasn't involved. It had nothing to do with him. But now that perspective is beginning to change. What if the Trump administration was complicit in what Russia was doing vis-a-vis our November elections? What if the Trump and members of the Trump administration were involved in the hacking, knew it was going on and took advantage of it, indeed helped it along, colluded with the Russians in order to fix the election? That would be an offense. That would be a national scandal. People are beginning to talk about that. This morning, there were 2 interviews conducted on the MSNBC Morning Joe show. One with Speaker Paul Ryan of the House, the other with Mitch McConnell, majority leader in the Senate. Both of them made the point of asserting that while they had both pretty much accepted the fact that the Russians were involved in interfering with our elections, and therefore that an investigation was called for, they could not condone or did not for a second believe that the president or any of his staff was directly involved in that effort, which would necessitate an independent investigation by an independent prosecutor. The difference would be a behind closed door secret investigation conducted by the Intelligence Committee committees in the House and the Senate, both of them staffed by a majority of Republicans and Republican leaders in both houses who would have a vested interest in not finding anything wrong against the president. On the other hand, you've got the Democrats lobbying for a wide open, major independent investigation with independent leadership. This morning, I heard the recommendation that perhaps it could be co-chaired by former Supreme Court Justice O'Connor, Sandra Day O'Connor, and perhaps the former Secretary of State, the Republican Secretary of State in the Bush administration. The argument is Their argument is that this is not a partisan, would not be a partisan investigation. It is investigation of a major threat to the security of the electoral apparatus of our government itself. So this argument about collusion of the administration in the Russian hacking of the Democrats during the campaign is taking on some credibility. It's gaining ground. And you can tell because the Republicans are making it their first point to deny that it's true, which means that it's obviously bothering them. The fact of the matter is, and this is clearly a political reality that all of us live through, throughout the campaign, if you recall, the Republicans were demanding a full investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails, as well as an open hearing investigation of the Benghazi situation. At the time, most of us realized that the more visibility Benghazi and Hillary Clinton's emails got, the better off it was for Republican chances in the fall elections. We have to realize that the same situation is going on now for the Democrats. They have everything to gain politically from this investigation. It couldn't do anything but turn up nothing, or anything it turns up would hurt the Republicans. This is a no-lose situation for Democrats, just as Benghazi was a no-lose political situation for Republicans. So I think we have to know it. The arguments are being labeled as nonpartisan. But the fact of the matter is partisanship is everywhere in Washington now, and I think we would all be naive if we didn't appreciate it. One other thing that is coming out of all of this Flynn situation, which I think makes it extremely relevant. This goes back some time to the release some weeks ago of the infamous Steele dossier, which was the dossier on Donald Trump put together by the special agent in Britain that was published by BuzzFeed a few weeks ago. A 35-page dossier of allegations and charges against the behavior and the personality and character of Donald Trump. The media, for the most part, was reluctant to touch it because so much of it was filled with errors, supposedly. There was so much of it that was undocumented information that media outlets were reluctant to touch it. CNN picked it up and basically put out a 2-page summary of the dossier, but didn't get into all the nasty details that were in the dossier. But you'll recall that Donald Trump attacked it viciously and basically put the media on notice that he would attack them viciously if they gave it any credibility at all. So the result is that over the last week and a half or so, the dossier itself has kind of faded into the background. It became so toxic a subject that nobody would touch it, which obviously was a victory for Donald Trump, because nothing in it was positive for him. Everything in it was negative toward him. But lo and behold, now we are beginning to see that much of this Michael Flynn situation has brought out information which indicates that there's more and more of what's in that dossier that now is seeming to be credible. Things that were not at all believed to be true before are now being taken seriously. The legitimacy of the contents of the dossier, at least some of the contents, is being sustained as a result of the information coming out in this Flynn situation. And let me repeat, because I mentioned this before about a week and a half ago. One of the items in the dossier deals with Michael Trump's relationship with Russian business interests. This is information that a lot of people were asking about during the campaign, because so much of Donald Trump's business dealings in Russia with Russians was unknown. We couldn't get our hands around it. Part of the reason, of course, was that Trump had refused to make public his tax records, his income taxes. So it was impossible to know exactly what his business dealings have been. We know a little bit, but we don't know nearly enough. In the dossier was information that suggested that the Russian governments had made a quid pro quo offer to Donald Trump, that in exchange for 19% of the stock in the largest Russian oil company there is, I believe the name of it, I believe, is Rosneft or something like that. That's the name of the oil firm. It's doing major drilling in the Arctic. And very honestly, ExxonMobil is heavily involved in that, which makes the Rex Tillerson nomination and confirmation for Secretary of State very interesting. But the dossier reports that Vladimir Putin offered Donald Trump 19% control of the company in exchange for the lifting of the sanctions if he gets in office. At first, that information, along with the entire dossier, was considered to be totally untrue and not even worth looking at. But now so much of what is in the dossier has become credible that that possibility suddenly is looming as being credible as well. Especially since the topic of interest in the entire Michael Flynn conversations with the Russian ambassador revolved around the sanctions. The very thing that the dossier said Putin had offered. The very same thing that Putin wanted in exchange for the 19% stock transfer to Donald Trump. So there we are. And now this morning we learn that Michael Flynn's conversations with the Russian ambassador were not the only conversations between Russian intelligence and the Trump administration during the campaign. That other members of the Trump campaign were heavily involved in ongoing discussions with Russian intelligence. And the name Paul Manafort has resurfaced. You'll remember that Donald Trump removed Manafort from his campaign because of the negative publicity that was coming out about Manafort's connections with Russia. Now the situation is surfacing where Manafort's role during the campaign in ongoing conversations with Russian intelligence now suddenly are taking on a very serious air, if you will. They're being considered very, very serious. And on it goes. It is absolutely incredible, especially when you consider that we are only 3.5 weeks, not even 4 weeks, into this administration. I mentioned several minutes ago that we'll be taking up an issue about the president, about Donald Trump, in a moment, because all of this has been about members of the Trump administration, but not much of it so far has been about Donald Trump. A little bit of it about the conversation with the media on Air Force One last Friday evening, for example, and some of it. But the question is, what's going on with Donald Trump in all of this? And I'm looking through my notes here because I do have some. This morning, before 7 a.m., President Trump engaged in one of his regular tweet storms. As tweet after tweet came from Donald Trump this morning, from before 7 a.m. for the better part of the next hour. The New York Times this morning posted a list of 6 tweets that Donald Trump had put out this morning in the space of about 40 minutes. I had copied that because I wanted to share some of those tweets with you. And then in looking at the Washington Post, I saw that the Washington Post had pretty much done the same thing. But actually, it was a bit more comprehensive. So I switched, and I want to share this with you. All I want to do is share with you some of the tweets. The thing to keep in mind, especially in light of the background, the information that we've just had. In other words, now we're in a frame of mind where we kind of know what the situation is. Now let's look at what Donald Trump thinks about what the situation is. And he made it very clear in a series of tweets this morning. So I ask you to reflect, to consider seriously the following. First, Mr. Trump made the point in one tweet. The Russian connections were nothing more than a Democratic conspiracy fed to a receptive news media to distract from the mistakes made by Hillary Clinton during the campaign, unquote. So all of this is a Democratic conspiracy in combination or in collusion with a receptive news media in order to detract attention away from the mistakes that Hillary Clinton's campaign made during the election. Yet another tweet. The real scandal here is that classified information is illegally given out by intelligence like candy. Very un-American. In other words, the real issue here, the president is saying, is that the intelligence community is leaking intelligence that it has no business making available to the public. Third, this Russian connection nonsense is merely an attempt to cover up the mistakes of the Clinton administration. That one was at 7 a.m. Minutes later, Information is being illegally given to the failing New York Times and Washington Post by the intelligence community, the NSA and FBI, just like Russia. The New York Times on Wednesday disclosed broader contacts between Russian intelligence officials and people with ties to the Trump campaign and to Mr. Trump's business empire during and after the campaign. The next tweet. The fake news media is going crazy with their conspiracy theories and blind hatred. At MSNBC and CNN are unwatchable. Fox News and Friends is great. And finally, the president praised a column by Eli Lake in Bloomberg News, which criticized the selective leaking of intercepted communications between Mr. Flynn and the Russian ambassador to Washington. Mr. Lake went on to suggest that Flynn really had been sacrificed in order to protect other officials, potentially including the president himself. Interestingly enough, the president recommended that tweet, even though the last part, I would think, he wouldn't support. I remind you that on the morning after he resigned, which was yesterday morning, the last thing that Michael Flynn did was tweet one word, scapegoat, which kind of validates this Bloomberg News article, column, which suggests that Flynn was ultimately falling on his sword in order to cover up activities by other members of the Trump administration. If you look at all of these tweets and look for common themes, a couple are absolutely unmistakable. The president continues to attack the media. The president continues to insist that the Democrats have really still not accepted the defeat in the election. And so much of this is an effort to cover up what turned out to be an unsuccessful campaign. It's important to keep in mind, of course, that despite the 3 to 5 million illegal votes that the president continues to claim existed with no evidence, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote by close to 3 million. So the Democratic campaign, while it may have been unsuccessful, was not as unsuccessful as the president is implying here. But be that as it may, that's a technicality. But what we're seeing is the president's major concerns are, first, the partisan nature of the Democratic attack. Second, the criticism of the news media and its insistence on putting out what he calls fake news. I think all of this is important because the third theme of these tweets suggests that the president is more concerned with the leaks coming out of the intelligence community than he is the content of the leaks. The reality is that if the leaks coming out are to be believed, then what they are doing is reporting things that are really happening. The leaks are suggesting that there are things going on within the administration that are questionable, if not illegal. And rather than going after these illegalities, the president is focusing on keeping the illegalities behind closed doors so that the general public doesn't know about them. So the only way he can do that is to attack the credibility of the media. And so he does that. And of course, simultaneous with that, he praises Sean Hannity, Fox News, Fox and Friends, because Fox is not attacking him or criticizing him. They are endorsing and supporting what he does. So that's the way to get on his good side. The one thing I know, and this is what I concluded in my posting on Facebook last evening, was that one thing is very clear, and that is if we didn't have the media, this is a classic example of the need for a free press. Because there is a basic goal of any administration is to control the flow of news, to suppress the negatives and accentuate the positives. And it's only the news that can dig out the truth. The media. We have got to basically support a free press. The role at the Washington Post of David Ignatius in digging out a lot of this information is very, very emblematic of the role the Washington Post made in digging out the information behind Watergate. Woodward and Bernstein, if you remember. We never would have known what was going on in Watergate except for the investigative journalism of the Washington Post and the willingness of the New York Times to publish the Pentagon Papers, which revealed what was really going on behind the scenes with the Vietnam War, and the fact that information was being fabricated in order to give the American people the impression that we were winning in Vietnam when in fact we were not. The Pentagon Papers made very clear what really was going on. And once the general public got their hands on that kind of information, the war would come to an end. The same kind of thing is happening now. The attack on the media, the attack on the intelligence community, the attack on the leaks coming out of the intelligence community, the efforts of the administration to suppress what's going on within the administration rather than fix what's going on within the administration is disturbing. It's frightening. It's important. And I think all of us need to pay close attention to it. With that, we're getting very close to the top of the hour. In fact, I think even though we're 5 minutes before the top of the hour, I really think that we reached a good point to take our 5-minute break, because we're going to be going into different topics, somewhat different topics, in our second hour. All of this related, of course, to the constitutionality associated with all of this. All of this has very important implications for a program like this on the Constitution of the United States. The role of representatives, the role of diplomacy in the world, the role of the intelligence agencies, the issues of constitutionality, the idea of a free press. All of these things are involved here. They are all important to us. Yesterday, we spent the bulk of our program on the emoluments clauses. There are two in Articles 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States. So for those people who might be a little bit concerned that we're seeming to veer away, quite far away from the Constitution, the reality is we haven't gone too far away from it at all. So with that, I'd like to pause and take our 5-minute break. We're still a couple of minutes before the top of the hour, but that's fine. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. There'll be some music. I know Agnes will have some music for us. And then we'll come back and we'll begin our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Wednesday, the 15th day of February. Thank you. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center. We've just passed the top of the hour. It's 2 minutes after the hour. It is a pleasure to be with you today. If you are just joining us, welcome. Our first hour today was pretty much a summary of yesterday's program, which was an effort to kind of pull together the events of the last 36 to 48 hours related to the Michael Flynn resignation as National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, and some of the implications of that have occurred within the last 24 hours. Calls for an independent investigation, the political nature of these calls, the links or the comparison between the role of the Democrats, Democratic behavior in this political situation, as opposed to the way Republicans behaved during the campaign, in the way they treated the Benghazi situation, demanding full investigations, full disclosure to the world about the emails and the details of the situation which it was unfolding in Benghazi. It's the same kind of thing. It's obviously an opportunity for making political hay in an increasingly partisan political world. We all know that. But the reality is we've got to keep separate the political side as well as the national security side. And I think there is definitely while there is a separation here, there's obviously a connection. I don't think we can let our concerns about partisanship overcome our desires to protect the security of the nation and the peace of the world. A lot of people are really becoming quite concerned with some of the things that seem to be happening simultaneously with this Michael Flynn situation. The bold nature of some of the Russian steps, the fact that North Korea fired off a ballistic missile on Sunday, the mysterious murder by 2 women of the half-brother of the president of North Korea. The fact that as we went on the air today at 1 p.m., a Russian intelligence ship was cruising off the coast of Connecticut, 30 miles from the U.S. submarine base at New London. Everything seems to be happening at the same time, and it frightens and disturbs a lot of people, and I know that. So that's the kind of world we're in. That's the kind of world we're trying to make sense of, and I welcome you to the Virtual Center on this Wednesday, the 15th day of February. We do invite you to participate actively in our program. There's an awful lot to think about, an awful lot to reflect upon, an awful lot of information to digest, and most importantly, an awful lot of information to share. I invite you to do that by sharing your thoughts and your ideas with our listeners. We have a phone number that is available exclusively for that purpose. If you call this phone number, you will get into the Head On Radio Network studios. Agnes is there, and she will immediately get you on the air. That phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me that way through an email, is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien906 at gmail.com. And once again, I do invite you to visit our Facebook page. In fact, the substance of our entire first hour was taken from a Facebook posting which I put on there last evening, which was a summary of our program yesterday. So I wanted to use that as kind of a refresher or a review, if you will, in our first hour today of yesterday's program. Because while we will be going into issues that are a little bit different, they are all in effect related to the kinds of situations that all of us see around us. So if you go to Facebook, you can check on our postings, and I invite you to react to them. You can comment on Facebook, you can drop me an email, or you can call in on our 304-663-4676 line. If you go to Facebook, the homepage, just go to the search box at the top and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be onto our Facebook page. Welcome to the Virtual Center on this Wednesday, the middle of February, the 15th of February. It is a pleasure, and I hope that your time in this hour spent with us you will find to be rewarding. If you do, then I invite you to please do it again. Please come back. Share the listing, the idea with your friends, and invite them to join us as well. We would sure appreciate it. Last month, if you'll recall, there was a new government that took over in Great Britain. And in fact, the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, visited the Trump White House about a week ago, maybe a little bit over a week ago. And it was the first head of state that visited the new Trump administration. This past weekend, of course, we had Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who spent the weekend with the president and was kind of a witness to all of this Michael Flynn stuff rolling around Washington over the weekend. In fact, you'll recall that Abe was a weekend guest at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago retreat on Sunday morning when word came that North Korea had fired its ballistic missile, which went 300 miles into the Sea of Japan and then went into the sea. It was considered to be provocative. It's considered to be a test of the new Trump administration and all the rest of it. But when Theresa May became Prime Minister of Great Britain after the Brits made the decision to leave the European Union and new elections, Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, called for new elections and a new government. A new government was indeed put into power in Great Britain, and Theresa May became Prime Minister. And she delivered an address that focused on her anticipation as to what leaving the European Union would mean for Great Britain. I don't know how many people are aware of or were aware of that speech. But in it, she projected a world of British power and hegemony worldwide that suggested the global empire that Great Britain maintained for so many centuries. With the as you'll recall in Western history, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1488, Britain became preeminent on the seas of the world, on the oceans of the world. and Great Britain launched into a quest for colonies and empire that stretched around the world and continued well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The stories about the British Empire, British control in China, for example, British control in India, and the efforts of Mahatma Gandhi in fighting for Indian independence, the various independence wars of revolution that occurred after World War II on the continent of Africa, as new nation after new nation after new nation emerged independent from under the control of Britain's thumb. And of course, after World War II, the United States emerged as the major power in the world, and Great Britain kind of receded into the background as a result of that. And Britain was faced with a decision about the European Union, whether to become a full-blooded member of the European Union or rather to remain separate from the Union and kind of be a partner in the Union, but not a full-fledged member. To become a full-fledged member, for example, would have meant that Britain would have had to abandon its currency, the pound and the pence and all of those things we're familiar with, and have adopted the euro as its principal currency. Britain never made that decision. Britain always remained separate enough to avoid the total inclusion into the European Union. And then came the decision, the vote, in the fall to leave it. And we'll all remember how much candidate Donald Trump supported that vote in Great Britain when it happened. This article, this op-ed piece, appears in today's Washington Post. And the title of it is Theresa May's Empire of the Mind. The author is Tom Wyman. The article is dated today, February 15th, 2017. And it is about the vision that Theresa May has for a Britain freed from the controls and the limitations of European Union involvement. The article makes reference of a cartoon which appeared in the Daily Mail, which is a conservative newspaper in London. It's referred to in this article as a right-wing tabloid, which kind of gives us some insight into the overall direction of this particular article. But in that cartoon, Theresa May, with her head thrust high proudly into the air, is standing on the edge of the White Cliffs of Dover, with the Union Jack flying behind her as she trampled the flag of the European Union. The implication is the very jingoistic cartoons in the 1890s related to Cecil Rhodes and the Colossus, the British Colossus, over South Africa. And that brings us to the speech. In it, and I'm reading you directly from this particular article in today's Washington Post, in her Brexit speech, Theresa May invited us to imagine, quote, the global Britain that will somehow emerge once the country leaves the European Union, its citizens instinctively looking, as she has claimed that the British do, to expand their horizons beyond Europe and exploit opportunities across the world. The speech, this article says, is a sanitized version of the dream of a British Empire in which every corner of the globe could be imagined as an Englishman's rightful backyard. This has been an image that the supporters of the Brexit vote, the vote to leave the European Union, have been projecting for a long time. Now, for example, cartoons like the Daily Mail cartoon, along with the rhetoric that Theresa May included in this speech, this kind of points in a direction that the New World Order, which is taking shape, promises for a revitalized Great Britain. Why do I bring this particular issue to the fore now? The similarity is striking with the determination and the decisions being made within the Trump administration to abandon, which of course he's already done by executive order, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to renegotiate NAFTA, to basically renegotiate issues surrounding the One China policy in the Far East. The implication is that the world order that was created and led by the United States after World War II is over. And that the result is not something to be feared by the United States in an administration headed by Donald Trump, but the result is one to be relished. The opportunity is one to be welcomed by a nation that can break free from the controls and the limitations of membership in NATO and in NAFTA and in Trans-Pacific and many of these other partnerships, which put us in league with nations which are effectively our commercial and business rivals. This gives us an opportunity to ultimately reach our potential as the most powerful nation in the world. The fact is we are, and the fact is the world order that exists is one which was created by and it continues to be headed by the United States. Clearly, the decision of the Trump administration is to abandon it and to go in a different direction. Clearly, Britain's decision to leave the European Union is driven by the same kinds of potential, the same dream, if you will. What we are returning to is a different kind of world, a world that most of us have never experienced, because most of us, I'm guessing, are people who were born after World War II. There may be a few of us out there that were born in the 20s and 30s, but the vast majority of us were born after World War II. So the only world we've known is the world we've come to know, Pax Americana. And the similarities between the future projected in the speech of Theresa May and the future being articulated by Donald Trump in some of the policies he's talking about and the executive orders he's already signed or will be signing in the future suggest that America is going in a different direction. And the one thing that I think all of us need to be aware of is that it is very clear, if you think about it, that the vast majority of those people responsible for the election victory of Donald Trump did not, and could not envision this kind of an outcome. They wanted things to be different. They wanted change. They dreamed about the good old days. just as Theresa May is alluding to Britain's good old days. But the implications and the full meaning of what these kinds of changes implied, I would suggest, probably escaped the vision of the people that were voting for this government. Donald Trump is ultimately claiming a mandate for the kind of change that reality tells us the people theoretically who gave him that mandate had no way of anticipating or even envisioning. But this isn't the end of it. I mentioned earlier that I was going to try to be doing something that I wasn't sure how this would come off. But I think since this is our last hour of programming here this week, I think it's important to get it out there and give all of you an opportunity to think about it and reflect on it. We can get back to it next week, perhaps. In this morning's New York Times, one of the regular columnists there, Thomas Friedman, has a column. And his column is related to the visit which is going on right now at the White House of Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, and the discussions that are going to be going on and are going on right now with President Trump. It's important to recognize that while these discussions involve international issues, involve issues of military and strategic importance, it's important to mention that the president is conducting these kinds of meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu without a national security advisor, Michael Flynn. We talked about him. He's not there. Defense Secretary Mattis is in Europe dealing with NATO and the other nations in NATO. He's not there. So there's a concern on the part of some that the president is involved in these kinds of discussions over the Middle East and the future of the Middle East, and doesn't have the diplomatic troops at his elbow that perhaps he ought to have. It's a little bit scary. But be that as it may, it's critically important because it deals with the world's perennial hotspot, the Middle East, specifically the future of the Arab-Israeli struggles. More specifically, the traditional position of the United States that the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian situation is a two-state solution versus the alternative, which is rapidly coming to the fore, that there could be a one-state solution, and that Netanyahu's behavior with the expansion of the settlements into the West Bank, which is contested territory, Palestinian territory, tends to suggest more and more that Netanyahu believes that ultimately the solution can be and will be a one-state solution, which is Israeli control over the whole thing, over the whole area. What that would mean is that 2.7 million Palestinians would be the majority within an Israeli state governed by a Jewish minority. The concerns are that one-state situation would mean the end of the illusion of Israeli as a democracy in the Middle East. Israel would become a dictatorship. It would become autocratic. It would be in the position of governing a majority of citizens within a country that they feel is their own. That's the issue that Thomas Friedman took on in his article this morning. His article is, in effect, a letter to President Trump. And his effort to make the point that Donald Trump is the last hope that we have for the possibility of a two-state solution. His explanation goes back to a situation about a golf course in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. Let me share this with you. The situation at the Woodmont Golf Course deals with Barack Obama's frequent invitation to play golf at this golf course. It is, Friedman tells us, a mostly Jewish golf club in Maryland, where Obama played as a guest several times during his presidency. Near the end of his term, it was rumored that Obama would actually seek membership in the Woodmont Country Club. Then, you'll recall, Obama clashed with Netanyahu over the president's refusal at the United Nations to veto a Security Council resolution condemning Israel's expansion of Jewish settlements into the West Bank. Shortly after that happened, the Washington Post reported that a member of the Woodmont Golf Club, Faith Goldstein, had sent a private email to the club's president declaring that Barack Obama, quote, is not welcome at Woodmont because of his UN veto. Friedman now begins to comment on this situation. It was appalling, he said, to think that Jews, who for so many years were excluded from joining country clubs, would consider excluding our first black president for his acting on the basis of what half of the people of Israel believe, that the continued expansion of Jewish settlements into Palestinian-populated zones of the West Bank will eventually make the separation of Israelis and Palestinians in a two-state solution impossible, and thereby threaten Israel's character as a Jewish democratic state. At the end, the membership at Woodmont came to the fore, and Barry Foreman, club president, invited the Obamas to join the club and said, quote, "It is all the more important that Woodmont be a place where people of varying views and beliefs can enjoy fellowship," unquote. Friedman explains why he's telling this story to Donald Trump in relationship to the Netanyahu visit at the White House, which is going on right now. Israel is getting closer and closer every day, he says, to wiping out the possibility of a two-state solution. Just last week, he points out, Netanyahu's government pushed through the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, a new law declaring that wildcat Jewish settlers who had illegally set up caravans on private West Bank Palestinian land would have their settlements legitimized, legalized, but would have to pay the Palestinian landowners compensation for the land. In other words, the Netanyahu government is legitimizing and legalizing the behavior of squatters on Palestinian land, promising them compensation to the Palestinian landowners. This is very similar. This is me talking, not Thomas Friedman. This is very similar to the idea of abolishing slavery by compensating the slave owners for the property that is being taken from them. It, in effect, legitimizes slavery. This legislation in Israel legitimizes colonialism. Friedman said he hopes that the Israeli Supreme Court will strike down the law. But he also points out that the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, criticized Netanyahu's move and didn't mince words doing it. Rivlin said that Israel can't just apply and enforce its laws on territories that are not under its sovereignty. It can't apply its law on somebody else's land. If it does so, it is a legal cacophony. It will cause Israel to be seen as an apartheid state, which it is not. And Friedman repeats that phrase, an apartheid state. And then he says, President Trump, Jewish history has its eyes on you. Traditionally, as long as the two-state solution was a possibility, then the debate within Israel amongst Jews was between more security or less security, between the right and the left, between conservatives and liberals. But for the most part, all Jews could agree that Israel would remain a Jewish democratic state. But if Netanyahu's leadership and his overreach erases the two-state solution, then it's going to move, the debate is going to move from left versus right to right versus wrong. The debate will not be about which are the best borders to defend the state of Israel, but whether the state is worth defending at all in moral terms. Israel will have lost its soul. Israel will have lost its meaning for those who were instrumental in the creation of Israel in the 1940s at the end of World War II. That's on the table, says Thomas Friedman to President Trump. That's what's at stake in this meeting that's going on today. How does this relate to the story told earlier about the Theresa May speech in Great Britain? What we are seeing, I think, is the same kind of mentality rearing its head in various places around the world. What Netanyahu is doing and the way he is acting in Israel and with the Palestinians is quite similar to the global dreams of Theresa May and those who orchestrated the vote to take Great Britain out of the European Union. It is the same kind of vision that led those people who were the most ardent and adamant supporters of Donald Trump to be president of the United States. They became so fixed on a world that is different than the world that exists that they could excuse the mistakes and the errors and the moral questions surrounding the Trump presidency. They could overlook the comments. They could overlook the attacks and the criticisms which became so prevalent during the campaign of 2008. The same kind of thing is happening throughout the world. What we are seeing is a major change in attitude and philosophy and ideology throughout the world. It's very important that we recognize that what is going on is not just local. It's not just happening within our own country. It's not just happening within our own hemisphere, in fact. In this morning's New York Times, one of its regular columnists, Ross Douthat, wrote a piece on those people who see a similarity between what's going on with the Trump presidency here in America and what's going on in the Vatican. What is spurring that particular situation is a rather faint connection between Stephen Bannon, the former Breitbart executive who is now in Trump's inner circle and sits on the National Security Council, and Cardinal Raymond Burke, who is the major conservative critic within the College of Cardinals of Pope Francis. And there is an effort on the part of some, Douthat claims, to connect the Trump presidency, or the Trump era, as he calls it, through a Catholic mirror, pointing out that the very same challenge that conservative members of the clergy under the leadership of Raymond Burke posed to Pope Francis is the challenge that the Trump administration poses to liberal democracy throughout the world. The reason I mention all of these together is because this morning the similarity and the thematic connections here are beyond belief. Can you imagine that there might be connections, links, between Netanyahu's behavior in Israel, Cardinal Burke's behavior in the Vatican, and Donald Trump's activities here within the United States and on the world stage? What we are seeing is major challenges to the status quo. Burke poses a conservative challenge within the church, within the Catholic Church, to a liberal pope that Donald Trump poses to liberal democracy throughout the world. And the vote of those in Great Britain who wanted to leave the European Union had their vision expressed in the speech of Prime Minister Theresa May about the vision of a different world under a different set of rules and obligations. So also is Netanyahu doing the very same thing in trying to resolve the Palestinian situation in ways which he feels are legitimate and justified. That's the connection. In other words, what I'm proposing and what I'm trying to develop here, and I mentioned at the beginning that this would be difficult and I wasn't sure if I could pull it off because it's so complex. But what we are seeing is 4 different examples in 4 different areas which illustrate the nature of the enormity of change that is happening throughout all segments of the world as most of us know it and understand it. Because the world we've been in is the only world we know. And what we're seeing all around us are examples of a different world being proposed by those who would challenge the status quo within their own limited particular environment. A little bit of detail about the situation within the Vatican. Many people, many traditional Catholics, are very concerned about the liberal direction that this Pope seems to be taking their church. And their concerns are being expressed more than by anybody else by Cardinal Raymond Burke. Burke was an archbishop in St. Louis up until 2008. Then he was transferred to La Crosse, Wisconsin. And then he was appointed by John Paul II to the College of Cardinals. And he has become an influential voice for conservatives within the College of Cardinals. And as such, he's become a major critic of Pope Francis and the policies and directions that he seems to be taking the church in. E.J. Dionne, who writes, he's a Catholic columnist at the Washington Post, pointed to the connection between Stephen Bannon and the Pope as revealing a struggle, quote, to define the meaning of both Americanism and Catholicism, unquote. In other words, what Douthat is suggesting and what E.J. Dionne is suggesting is that Steve Bannon reflects the same challenges here within America as Cardinal Burke proposes to Pope Francis in the Vatican. Another writer for the Washington Post, Emma Kate Simons, accuses Cardinal Burke, the conservative, of, quote, using his position within the walls of the Vatican to legitimize extremist forces that want to bring down Western liberal democracy, unquote. In other words, what she sees is the conservative of Cardinal Burke within the Vatican in a much bigger arena. She sees the challenge that Burke poses to the Catholic Church as being equivalent to the entire challenge that's going on throughout the world to Western liberal democracy. The challenge epitomized in America by Donald Trump, in Israel by Benjamin Netanyahu, in Great Britain by Theresa May, and those who orchestrated the vote to leave the British Union. The author of this article, Ross Douthat, is a little bit skeptical about these analogies. He says that a lot of this almost smacks of being conspiracy theory, the implication being that all of these things are connected. But he does acknowledge that the similarities are so clear that at least it's not out of the realm of likelihood that expressing them helps us understand better what's going on. He denies the idea that there's a conspiracy afoot to topple liberal democracy all over the world, and that all of these movements are connected. It's kind of interesting, and this, I guess, is the historian in me speaking, but it's kind of interesting when I think back to the Cold War. Because during the height of the Cold War, and I grew up in it, during the height of the Cold War, there was this assumption throughout America that the Russians and the Chinese and Fidel Castro and all of these nations that were part of the so-called communist conspiracy were linked. They were all joined together in a conspiracy to topple our way of life. We know now that that wasn't true. That what made all of these communist areas of the world connected was that the one thing they had in common was opposition to Western capitalism. That was the thing that united them. But the idea that there was an actual conspiracy on board, the idea that someone in Moscow was pushing all the buttons and said, now we'll have a revolution in Cuba, and then we'll have another one in Nicaragua, and then we'll have a situation in North Korea, and was all being directed from Moscow. That's what many people believed. It was easy. It was easier to believe if you believed that. But the fact of the matter is, it was nothing but conspiracy theory. Ross Douthat argues that this thing going on now smacks of conspiracy theory, which I think is somewhat similar to that. But then he begins to look at what's going on in Rome. And he's making the point that the conservative opposition reflected and being articulated by Raymond Burke, Cardinal Burke, is very similar to the challenge to liberal democracy that Trump's policies and positions pose here in the United States. There's one piece of this I wanted to share with you. Douthat says the drama in the church is in reality a kind of photo negative of the drama that's going on in Washington, D.C. In both situations, a provisional center has cracked, and a form of steamrolling populism has taken power. In both contexts, ideas from the fringes, far right and far left, radical and traditional, suddenly have unexpected resonance. The difference is that in Rome, the populace isn't a right-wing president, he's a radical pope. And this is where Douthat's conservatism in his view of Catholicism comes through. Clearly, Douthat is part of the group, the conservative group, that is very critical of Pope Francis and the liberalism that he poses. So he's much more in the Raymond Burke camp than he actually admits. He sees danger and problems for the Catholic Church in some of the policies that the new Pope, Pope Francis, is proposing. Then he gets in to Raymond Burke. And he uses this analogy. And he says, just the way that Trump supporters regard the anxiety of DC insiders and policy experts and journalists who see a sign that Trump's moves are working and that he's finally draining the swamp. So many people believe that Pope Francis is draining the Roman swamp. And he says within the church, there are mostly among the church leadership what he calls institutionalists, people who believe in the sanctity of the church as an institution. They are divided, he says, just as mainstream politicians are divided in their concern over what Donald Trump is doing. So also there are many institutionalists within the church who are concerned about what the Pope is doing. And he said there are different groups or factions within these institutionalists in the church. There's one group that has thrown in with Pope Francis completely, whether it's because of opportunism or whether it's because they really agree with him. There's one group of institutional leaders within the church that's totally behind the Pope and what he's doing. Then there's a group that is hanging in the background, that's keeping their mouth shut, that is deeply cautious. They're waiting for the dust to settle. They're going to wait to see what happens. They're hoping that a lot of this stuff will go away. And then there's a group that's openly critical of the Pope and what he's doing. But they're not quite willing, even though they're critical, they're not quite willing to come out into the open as avowed opponents of the Pope. And Douthat says the analogy in America could be people like John McCain and his reaction to Hillary Clinton. In other words, John McCain was against Hillary Clinton, but the two weren't that different in so many ways. And then there's the last group. And this is the group that is totally opposed to what the Pope is doing. This is the group whose positions are being articulated by Cardinal Burke. All of this, he says, places Cardinal Burke in the same position relative to Francis as Bernie Sanders applies in relationship to Trump. He's a figure from the fringe whose ideas gain influence because the other fringe is suddenly in power. A reactionary critic of a radical pope, just as Bernie Sanders is a radical critic of a suddenly empowered spirit of reaction. I believe that this article not only is informative, but it also says an awful lot about Ross Douthat and where he comes from. What makes this particular article significant in our discussion, I believe, is the universality of the Catholic Church, the worldwide nature of the Catholic Church. The fact that this conservative reaction within the church to the liberal Pope Francis, whose leadership has been taken by Cardinal Raymond Burke, suggests that the same kind of challenges to the status quo are happening all over the world. It's kind of a worldwide context for within a worldwide institution that reflects what we're talking about in America, in Great Britain, and in Israel. The world order, as we've known it and as we've understood it throughout our entire lives, is being challenged. It's being challenged successfully. And it promises change that I think all of us are going to have to begin to appreciate. One thing that has become very clear to me already is that here within the United States in politics, Donald Trump has done what Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and all of them couldn't do. He has energized progressives. Actually, Bernie Sanders did too, but he has energized progressives and driven them into the streets. He's done what leaderships within the progressive movement couldn't do. And that is turned concern into action. The future of progressivism is in large part the result of what Donald Trump is doing and promises to continue to do. It's hard to know exactly what's going to happen because it's hard to know how solid and successful the opposition to what he's trying to do will become. We really haven't seen progressivism in action to the extent that it's happening now. I think that suggests that where things are going to go and end up is unclear at this point. It's too early to tell. It's hard to tell whether the progressive opposition is going to be successful enough to block the efforts of Donald Trump. It's also too early to tell whether, in fact, the ideology of Donald Trump himself might be altered and alleviated some, whether the implications and the pressures of the office itself might soften some of his strongest and sharpest political positions. I think all of this is a work in progress. That's it for today here at the Virtual Center. That's it for this week here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and evening. I hope you have a great week and weekend. For the Virtual Center, for the Head On Radio Network, and for Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and those good folks, thank you so very much. Have a wonderful weekend. Be kind and love each other. And hopefully we'll all be able to get back together again the first of next week. Thank you.